Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mastering Dungeons. I'm Shawn Merwin, here with King of the Universe, Teos Abadia. Is that too much? Does that
I
is
mean,
that
you know,
did I go too
uh,
far?
God Emperor of Dune was one of my favorite. No, I don't even know what to do with
Yeah,
that, Shawn. Thank you, but I guess maybe.
that's
But
that. Yeah,
along those lines of being pumped up in difficult times, uh, it has been really nice to get some very kind comments from people. I know you and I have talked about this, but there've been some really nice. I don't know if people are trying to make us feel better, sending us virtual care packages via kind comments, but it is really nice to hear, and it makes me think. And I made a point to say in the show at some point, please reach out to other people. I think at least I'm now covered. Shawn might need a little more tender love and care, but reach out to your favorite creators and send them some nice thoughts, because it does really make a huge difference in these weeks and months.
right. Yeah, even if you don't like me or like my work, just say, have a nice day. That's fine too. It's all good. Uh,
That's like code. Have
So,
a nice
like
day,
Ian,
Shawn.
Ian, yeah, exactly. Ian via Patreon says, "I just wanted you to write to both of you and say how much I appreciate your most recent show covering the OGL fiasco. I think your moderate and measured approach is a good one and helps us all keep things in perspective. Thinking of you both and the many creatives who this impacts so much, all the best." So we've gotten a lot of messages like that. So thank you to Ian and thank you to all of those folks who are helping at least me keep my blood pressure somewhere in the 180 range
Yeah.
rather than higher.
The footage of
Uh,
me, tearing apart pillows at home just didn't seem like good podcast material.
no, no. Only if you need that special like fireball sound effect of the whooshing of the feathers being spread all over the room.
I mean, who
Uh,
doesn't?
yeah, yeah. And to be honest, it is tough for Teos and I to talk about this because it's such a widespread, multifaceted issue that we can be on one side of an issue, but we can see someone on the other side just being ridiculous.
Yeah.
So it puts us in the impossible position of trying to defend the indefensible in
Right.
in some cases. So we do try to look at all sides of things and keep things in perspective without too much bias coming into
Right.
the equation.
Yeah, and since we've slipped into the Tweetbag, Tootbag patron missive corner, there was a message that I didn't, I was almost like going to add it to the show notes, and I was like, that was sort of like, are you guys going to switch away from D&D or cover D&D less or cover third party more? And, it's a hard question because the truth is we do love the game, and we love the designers that work on the game, and we love the history of the game. And so, and I don't think the the team, let's say the corporation behind the game making mistakes, actually should change that, right? In fact, this is just like when TSR fell apart. There are times when the things go
Right.
down, and it's still worth covering and looking at. It's just more painful to do so, but we are still at the table having a best time. And I don't think I said this in the podcast. I think
Mhm.
I just said this to some friends, but I was reading Ben Riggs' book on history, and the year that TSR does its best is the year that I started playing. And I had no idea, right? And in fact, people working at TSR had no idea that the company was going downhill. And yet they've created some of the
Mhm.
most amazing products after I began, right? So for me as a kid, every year was better than the previous one, and almost always. And it was just, amazing. And so it all just seemed great when in reality, the revenue or profit were dropping, the problems were increasing, the instability was increasing. So you never know kind of that sort of mix, and one can still have an amazing time. And it could be that we've hit rock
Mhm.
bottom, in this current thing, and we're about to turn it all around. Or there might be more rock bottom yet to come. But the game at our table is
Yeah.
still fantastic. And so we do plan on
Right.
sticking to that. We always want to talk about how amazing other RPGs are, right? And how amazing third party creators
Mhm.
are. But it's hard to spend, if we do 10 episodes on Dresden Files, it's, I don't think that's going to serve everybody equally, right? So there's a mix there we're
Right.
trying to, I
Right.
don't know what you think, Shawn.
Yeah. But Yeah, but we will. We will talk about other games because we always have. We
Mhm.
not necessarily have gone into great detail, but we've talked about mechanics, or we've talked about themes, or we've talked about the the mechanics of game design and where D&D has drawn inspiration from, or where it has inspired other games. And we have a question later where we'll get into that, and we'll also talk about it, as we always do, when we talk about game design
Yeah.
and RPGs in general. So we have a missive here from Patreon by Bent Goblin, who is releasing his first release on the DM's Guild called Bent Goblin's Companion to Dragonlance Scales of War. And Bent Dragon asked us to take a look at it if we could, but to thank us for being one of the inspirations that led to this release. So we wanted to give Bent Goblin a shout out. And you did a little bit more in-depth research into
Yeah.
this than I did, so I'm going to let you take it over, Teos.
Yeah, so in our show notes, you'll find a link to the product itself on the DM's Guild. It's only $1.99. Also to bentgoblinpress.com, where the I think the very first post you'll find there is all about this product and what it has. So it has a map and description of 4 locations and 10 NPCs, a battle map for a key adventure confrontation, and again, all of this is meant to help the DM who's running the Dragonlance adventure, right? A backstory of how the NPC Riss comes to be, table of facts, rumors, and gossip about Vogler, 5 ingenious gnomish inventions, and more. And one of the things that the author prides themselves on, and I think rightly so, is they've come up with a kind of neat idea for sort of using these symbols and sort of bars that are in the layout on the side of each section that lets you at a glance know what this is providing to you and how to use it, which is a really neat concept.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, there's a lot here to look at. It's $2. So pick it up, take a look, support a listener of the show and fellow creator.
We also have via Mastodon this question from PhD20. What makes D&D D&D from a design and rules perspective? Matt Colville said something along the lines of D&D will never be a classless system because it would no longer be D&D. I'm curious to hear where that line is for you two. You often offer example design solutions, and I'm curious if this question is ever part of your process. The answer for me is yes. All of this is always a part of the process. Uh, when you design for D&D specifically, you don't ask yourself these questions. But when you start thinking in terms of redesigning or designing a new game, you definitely think. So, Teos, you want to go first on what makes D&D D&D for you?
I mean, it's a tough question. There is a lot that is the sort of skeleton of D&D, right? The way you're rolling the D20 and adding modifiers, the use of the ability scores and the pluses or minuses derived from those, the class system and the concepts, the idea of the play style and how it's going to ebb and flow to go through encounters. That is all that's all D&D in a critical way. And a lot of times when I'm designing, what I'm actually doing is I'm saying this is D&D. I'm going to work off of that, right? Like I'm going to bend it a little bit off of that because I know that that solidity is there and that the audience expects this. So if I can go a little bit outside, and so what I'm really doing is obviously or often is consciously bending away from what D&D is. And that D&D is sort of solid enough as a structure and recognizable to players and DMs is what allows me to do that, which is what I really love, right? So those things and knowing how far you can push it really is neat, right? So if you're developing something like, rules for mass combat, is a good example of something where often people have attempted, whether it's official products or otherwise, to make mass combat rules, and they don't quite feel like D&D because it steps away from the iconic nature of the character, the hit points, the attack rolls. It now becomes this representative thing, and it's not the same. So I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of how
Yeah.
I look at it.
Yeah, I think I'm along the same lines. For me, it's two things that together make D&D. One is the content of the fluff, right? It's the the magic missiles and the gods that you worship to get your spells and that sort of thing, married with the kind of play that the rules produce, the pacing of the game, the narrative outcome of the game, the back and forth between the game master and the players. So you could definitely have a D&D game without classes, I think. Just like we're starting to see D&D move away from races as a thing where you choose a race and you just get this menu of items. Now, removing a class would be a huge change. And some people would then claim that it's not D&D because we were there for 4th edition, where even the slightest tweaks to the rules led people to say this is not D&D, right? Wizards no longer memorize spells in the same way, so therefore it's not D&D. When of course it still is. So take the idea of rolling initiative during combat, then taking turns with the players and the DMs each using rolls to determine success or failures, hit points being lost and then regained, the players having autonomy over their own character's actions, the dungeon master having autonomy over the rest of the game. All of those things, all of that is D&D. When you're using weapons, you're slinging spells, and it's in a fantasy environment. So you could use that exact same rule system of rolling initiative, using spells or weapons, having actions, and so on, but take it out of the fantasy world, put it in the sci-fi world. It's no longer D&D. Right now you're talking about Espergenesis. It's a 5e system, but it uses these other things. Now, it's also important to note that based on this definition, that for me, Pathfinder is D&D. Those OSR games from the past, they're D&D. 13th Age for me is D&D because it still has that rhythm to it. It still has that sort of fluff in the background. And that's not a disparagement of any of those systems. It's just, for me, that's the delineation between D&D or not. Flip that around and you have something like Dungeon World, right? Where it uses the fluff of D&D. It uses some of the same concepts in its stories, in the telling of those stories. But since it uses the Powered by the Apocalypse engine, the pace and the narrative that evolves from gameplay is much different than that system of roll initiative. DM does their thing, players do their thing, and then you go in the cyclical pattern. So for me, Dungeon World's not D&D because it goes away from those game mechanics. And then we can get into various grades of those different things. But, so in terms of game mechanics, that's where it is for me.
Yeah, no, that's really neat. That's a neat way to look at it. And it's interesting you mentioned 13th Age. Both 13th Age and Fantasy Age will be in our news. And those are two games that seem like very D&D to me. And I want to say they're different, but they feel very similar. And in fact, the play experience is almost defined by those little places in the play experience that differ, right? The escalation die of 13th Age, or the stunts and how they manifest in play and what they can accomplish in Fantasy Age. Those things deviate a little bit away from it, but the rest of it feels very D&D. Like Fantasy Age to me is like a simplified D&D in a lot of ways, right? And so it is really interesting, and it's when you can't sort of easily say, well, there's this little thing that changes it, right? That's when it really isn't D&D, because there are enough of those pieces that it doesn't resemble it. It may be a fantasy game, but it's a totally different system, right? Like Legend of the Five Rings, when I played that a lot, is not like D&D. I mean, yes, it's an RPG, but all of the what the game's trying to do, the story of it, the meaningfulness of different things that you do, how your character's trying to do things, it's very different. And Shadowrun as well, right? It's not a dungeon type experience. Sometimes people would write those kinds of adventures, but they often feel a little odd because the system isn't really made to dungeon crawl. It's made to smash into a place and get out, right? And that kind of thing. And
Well, it goes back to what you said originally with, you start with the base and then you try to find ways to deviate slightly from it. That's what a lot of these, D&D like, D&D homages, D&D inspired games do is they take that base system and they're like, okay, we're going to add these different mechanics. It'll give you a different experience, but that all of the underpinnings are still there for what a D&D game really is.
Yeah, and it's a sign of the times maybe that this term has come up again, of the fantasy heartbreaker, right? And this is the
Mhm. Yep.
concept that someone will make a D&D game that's so much like D&D, but has some idea of, well, if this makes it different. And it's called the heartbreaker because often that whatever that little thing is that the person added doesn't make it worth playing for most people because, well, yes, you had a
Right.
cool, clever idea, but honestly, I can just play D&D. I could probably even port that idea over. Like, you haven't substantially created something different, right? And that's a lot of games fail on that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to see a lot of new games being made, and we
Yes,
will
I think so.
see how far those new games deviate from that system. But that is a long conversation for another time. A short conversation will be Jonathan Roy via Twitter asking, any chance you find folks would spend a little time uh, recognizing your favorite non-D&D systems and why? Would love a breakdown of how you feel different dice or core mechanics affect the feel of the game. And that is the $1 million question, Jonathan. So we're going to ask you. This is the last episode where we're going to be covering the player's handbook for 5e in detail. So what do you want next? Do you want us to talk about different games and compare them to D&D and what the different mechanics mean in terms of gameplay? Do you want us to go on and talk about the Dungeon Master's Guide in terms of 5e and what we think might change and what are some of the good and bad parts of what it delivers? Is there some other topic you want us to cover in detail? Right? Those questions we're going to leave to you, all our listeners out
Mm.
there, whether you're just following us, on Twitter or Mastodon, or if you're a patron. We want to hear what you want to hear going
Yeah.
forward. So let us know. That is our Tweetbag, uh, Tootbag Patreon missive section. Let's get right into the news. And we are going to start
Mm.
where everyone is expecting us to start, the OGL elephant in the room. I think this is our like fifth time that we've used that heading, but
It's
it
so big. It's
continues
so big, the
to
elephant.
be, yes, it is a pachyderm of great girth and might. And so since we last talked, we found out that D&D will solicit feedback on a revised OGL 1.2. So after all of the hubbub of what's been going on in a very weak statement from Wizards, we got a much stronger statement, including them explaining what are their motivations behind changes and asking the general public to give them feedback. Uh, I'm running out of breath, Teo, so I'm going to let you
Well, I mean,
take
one
it from
piece of
here.
news that, this is the kind of thing that always cracks me up is Wizard staff changes, right? So I had heard the name Kyle Brink, and I was sort of thinking, like, is that who's in charge? Like, are they going to at some point announce this? No, they're not even going to really announce it, except that Kyle Brink is going to write this blog post saying, "Hey, I'm the executive producer on D&D, and let me apologize and start over with a new approach." So I thought that was sort of, like, hey, welcome to your first, reaching out to the audience. Boy, what a way to have to do it. Kyle, lots of people say Kyle is a great person, so that's good to hear. And well, they've got a tall task that they're taking on here. Um, the There were a couple of things that happened. So one was this post that was made to create a new conversation on the OGL, and then the release of a OGL 1.2 and a survey for it. And we'll talk a little more about that. But as this was happening, we also had a number of rumors come out that seemed very concrete, and YouTube channels carried them very loudly, and there was a lot of despair over these things. And this included that there were that D&D was going to release a $30 subscription, a homebrew tier. You had to pay enough to be able to do homebrew on D&D Beyond. That there would be AI DMs, and D&D Beyond responded to all these saying this is all false, and multiple people came forward to say this was all false, and particularly around one of the accusations was nobody is actually reading your playtest feedback for D&D 1. So a lot of people came back and said, hey, we're doing, we really do look at the Unearthed Arcana comments. We, changed how we approach Strixhaven, things like that. And so I think that was interesting to see that sort of Wizards had been pushed so far back that they were like, okay, we have to actually respond to this. We can't let that go. We've got to say this is not true. But it raises this question of how people are getting their information. What is the difference between journalism and, someone told me? And I think we're going to see that continue to pan out and play out over the next few weeks, and hopefully not longer. But yeah, and any thoughts on that part of it, Shawn?
Yeah, the internet was created out of the ARPANET, which was created to, in case of nuclear disaster, make sure information was held in different places and would not all be destroyed all at once. And it's sort of now completely the opposite. The internet is there to destroy everything all at once, with no sense of keeping information, truth, or anything else discrete from rumor or innuendo. Yeah, I mean, this is what makes me hate the internet, right? It makes me feel like I can't just focus on the truth and bring out the truth that needs to be seen. Right. Because we're fighting against rumor mongers and people who are going to benefit from not only the truth of what happened, but the lies about what's happening. And bad actors out there who are trying to recycle and reclaim their good name by also jumping on the Wizards is horrible bandwagon. And we you and I know these people, and we see it, and it makes it hard to focus on what we need to, which is, legally speaking, what are we going to be allowed to create? Mm-hmm. And what does that mean for our creations and the things that we interact with when we play D&D? That's the important thing. And yeah, go ahead.
Or is the important thing, and really cast your mind millennia into the future, when the archaeologists of the future will look to the temples dedicated to the mighty algorithm and go, when did the algorithm rise as a god that we all served?
Yes.
And we must be careful.
Speaking of King of the Universe.
Yeah, let's please not create that future where it's the algorithm that drives everything. And so listeners, join us in trying to not let the anger and frustration be what drives all clicks and all content and shapes everything in the internet. But unfortunately, that's where we are. Yeah. But and it's not that there aren't reasons to be angry and frustrated. There clearly are. But there is always that need for intelligent discourse. So let's try to do a little bit of that, Shawn, and look at what the OGL 1.2 does, because this is a pretty fascinating approach. The OGL 1.2, first and foremost, is deauthorizing, revoking, whatever you want to call it, the current OGL 1.0A. So that right there is a deal breaker for a lot of people. It lets you continue to sell anything you previously published under 1.0A, but that's kind of, I think, fairly impossible to stop. That sort of would be a very tough legal battle to try to prevent people from being able to sell what they previously could sell under a license. Surprisingly, it places some D&D rules into the Creative Commons, and that ensures that Wizards doesn't own that anymore. It's out there. Anybody can use it. Anyone can base things off of it. That's pretty interesting. Though when you look at it, it's primarily the core mechanics and those things that probably are legally not copyrightable. If we say that whole, rules can't be copywritten, this is the type of stuff. So it takes very specific pages in the SRD and says, these are Creative Commons, these are not. And anything Creative Commons, you don't need a license, right? It would be out there. Anyone can use it. Anyone can do anything with it. These are sort of the general rules for mechanics. It's things like the conditions, it's XP levels, the definition of what monsters are made out of, sort of what the if you think about monster manual preamble, sort of those kinds of pieces. but there's a ton it doesn't include, like species, classes, subclasses, spells, monsters, deity pantheons. I mean, all kinds of aspects of the game
Mhm.
that are the actual sort of crunch of it that one would really employ, rather than the skeleton upon which that crunch holds. Um, Wizards has said more is going to be added to Creative Commons, but we don't know what. And so, at least looking at it, it looks like, well, if you were a creator and you tried to use the Creative Commons portion, I almost don't know what you would create other than like another game or just something
Mhm.
completely different you're developing. But when you can't even look at how a class and a subclass come together, I don't know what you really, do with that. Um, it's a little hard. And so what it really does is push you to say, well, for everything else, you need the SRD and you need the Open Gaming License 1.2. Before I go into that, Shawn, any thoughts so far?
Yeah, I think it was it's a good start.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it also shows that at its core, Wizards is a business, and they have goals, and they're going to tell us some of their goals. They're
Mm-hmm.
not going to tell us all of their goals because they don't want people, uh, competitors, others, to know what their business goals are. And if you have run or been a part of any business, you would be the same way,
Right.
right? So it's showing that these rules, they're recognizing these rules are not things that are of the utmost importance to their business. Whether they need to put it under Creative Commons or not is sort of irrelevant. It's great that they did. They may even add other versions of D&D to that, they've said,
Mm-hmm.
which would be really cool, right? That lets people go back and do things that maybe they didn't know they could, or maybe they thought they couldn't, or maybe it was a legal uncertainty whether they could. Now it's like, go ahead, do all the things. And that's a good first step. But in all of this, it's going to be a long, drawn out process
Yeah.
of uh, of give and take. And what will they give and what won't they give? And what will we as third party creators give and what won't we give
Well,
is
that's
the crux of this issue. And it's not going to work itself out in a day or a week or a month or maybe even a year. This is going to be a long process.
Do you think that Wizards is approaching this as a help us understand what you don't like so that we can move to that, or was this their furthest position? And like how much do you think they're willing to even adapt to the feedback in this survey?
I would say that they are still working out, they're still writing their software, right? They're doing a play test. So let's look at all of this in terms of software, right? You sit down with your development team and you say, what do we need this software to do and how are we going to do it?
Yeah.
You make those goals and then you build your software to do those things. Then you send it out to beta testers or alpha testers and you say, hey, use this. How does this work for you? What changes would you like to see made? Um, and what Wizards did not do is sit down and figure out how their users were going to use this. They just they tried to put out their final version to their mass audience when they should have started with this process and said, all right, these are our goals. Let's talk to our alpha testers, which would be like the larger companies or the larger individuals who use the open gaming license. And how does this work for you? Oh, the royalty scheme won't work. Your business will fold if you have to pay us royalties. Okay, cool. We'll get rid of that. What about this? What about that? Then
Yeah.
you get all that settled. Then you put out to the beta test to everyone and say, this is what we've come up with. What do you think?
Right.
And they've done it completely bass backwards.
Right.
And so in a sense, that then makes it harder for them to not show their hand in what is the most important and what is not to them, right?
Yeah.
They got rid of royalties right away without a second thought. So we know it's not about that. All right. Then what is it about
Right.
that you want to get rid of the open gaming license? Okay, well, let's reverse engineer this and we can figure out what exactly it is that. So, it's it's the same old story with any large business that you and I have both been in, where people get ahead of their skis, people try to do things too fast, they don't think things through, they don't
Yeah,
consult their customers enough, and that's why we're where we're at.
very true. Well, Shawn, let me go into this wording a bit. So 1.2 has a
Yep.
number of pieces to it. One is it doesn't fully have or doesn't really spell out open share like wording. So it doesn't really say the way that the previous open or the current open license says, hey, you can declare your content to be open or some portion of your content to be open. Here's how you do that and where you add this. So it brings up a lot of questions as to what the license is intended to serve as a function. There's languages that suggest that you can use any terms, or it states you can use any terms you want for your content. So it's not clear whether that's really saying to me that I can declare things open. And if I do, what does that mean? And what does it mean that something else has been declared content in the past? So, like if I published something yesterday under 1.0a and I declared a bunch of it open content, someone today using the same license, 1.0a, can use that. But what about under 1.2? Can we still do that? Can we put 1.0a into 1.2? Can I declare a 1.2 work to be partially open? And can someone then use that? It's not really clear. Another piece is that while it says that, hey, anything you made under 1.0a, you can continue selling, that doesn't have a lot of specifics. Like, let's say I need to revise it or update it. Can I do so? Or does it have to become 1.2? If I'm in the middle of creating something, is there a timetable that I can get to wrap up my current projects before I have to switch to 1.2? This is creating a lot of shock and confusion in the space. And so it would be nice if that was clarified. The language now for 1.2 says that it is perpetual, which means it doesn't have a stated end date. And it is irrevocable for a product you created with it. So if you publish a 1.2 product, it will remain so. But that's not really enough because they can still revoke or withdraw the license in a number of ways, the same way that 1.0 they are trying to remove it, whether you legally can or can't.
Right.
And that's a huge problem, right? Because it means you can't, as a creator of content, whether you're small, but especially if you're larger, you can't know that the project you're starting will get to finish, or that if you create a product that's, Tomo Beasts 1, that you will get to Tomo Beasts 4. And you don't know what could change down the road. And in fact, they even have a severability language that says that if any part of the license is held to be unenforceable or invalid for any reason, WotC can choose whether to have the entire thing invalidated. The typical language for something like this is everything else is still in force, right? So if for some reason they said, hey, you can't decide what, proper content is legally, then the rest would all still stand. But WotC gets to immediately go, because that one little piece was removed, the whole thing should go, right? And there are a number of pieces like that where, like if you are a creator and you mistakenly refer to something that isn't open, which happens all the time, WotC can choose to terminate the license for you, not the product, the entire license. There's nothing where you can correct your mistake. And so, wizards could do that. They could look at, say, if Paizo were to publish, they could look at everything and find one little mistake and say, I'm sorry, your entire license is voided based on this. Would they do that? Don't know. But there's no reason for the wording to exist this way, right? Class action suit rights are waived. So that prevents anybody from coming together as an industry to say, hey, wait, this is improper, which, given how small we all are, a lot of times would be necessary, right? That's one of the reasons why class action exists, is to allow the little people to function as if they were larger people. It's the little people that matter. And there's some language that suggests that, if you publish, well, it's 1.2 and licenses should require an agreement. That's a little unclear as to what when are we agreeing to 1.2? Is it when we say so? Or is there some other way that they are really saying you automatically have agreed to it, which would really not be okay, and automatically agreed that 1.0 has gone away?
Print versus PDF, right? That's what they want people to create, is print products or PDF products. but they get into language where they want to keep virtual tabletops from becoming video games, is essentially the way it sounds. So if your virtual tabletop only uses products, you're okay. But if they add animations to it, for example, that is moving in a direction that is approaching something that we now understand because of the language changes, that that's what Wizards does not want you to do,
Mm-hmm.
which tells us a lot about the direction where they're probably heading.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's another thing.
Yeah, they say it's royalty free. The language isn't really there. That's interesting. And what do you make of the sort of hateful content, conduct, illegal activity pieces?
Yeah, it's unclear. I'm no lawyer,
Hmm.
uh, by choice and by lack of intelligence, and I don't want to. I want to make my role playing games,
Yeah.
and you know, I'm not a rules lawyer in D&D, and I'm certainly not a rules lawyer here. So, what this sounds like to reasonable folks, it sounds like, yeah, okay, they don't want people bringing hateful things into their game.
Yeah.
The issue, of course, if you've been in a philosophy 101 class, is right, everything is in the eye of the beholder. What's hateful to one person is completely fine to another, and vice versa. And giving themselves the ability to say that hateful content is this or that means that they can take things down or suspend licenses, etc., for other reasons, and say it was because they didn't like this term that was used in this thing. So legally, it doesn't seem like it's something that anyone would want to get on board with, without some sort of oversight or give us time to fix it, or
Right.
something of that nature.
Yeah, there are a number of cases here where a number of parts in the license agreement where you would think there would be some ability, some recourse to correct the issue. Oh, did I mistakenly refer to something that isn't open content? Cool, let me fix that. Give me the option to
Mhm.
fix that, some path forward. Not I can just decide to remove the
Yeah.
your license for any future project products ever. And they similarly have some language around protecting themselves from lawsuits. To protect themselves
Mhm.
if somehow if they were to use your product or create something that is like your product. And some of that's understandable. I mean, any agreement these days sort of has that. Like if you join some sort of social media network, it will say, essentially that it has ownership, the ability to sort of own and move and manipulate your content, because otherwise you might sue for any small way that they misrepresent it. But this goes to the point where it's sort of saying, hey, you're promising you won't steal from others. But wizards, if somehow they did, and like if they were to use your work by mistake and put it in a product, you can only sue for your damages, which you have to demonstrate. You don't get to go beyond that, right? You can't say like, hey, you guys made all of these sales based on what I did. You used my idea, I should get that portion, right? And that
Mhm.
is just really shows this level of sort of protection that goes beyond protecting to sort of where it's unfair, right? It's one-sided.
Yeah, I this is important to me, because I've been on both sides of this issue. When I was in high school, I would send in ideas to Dragon Magazine or Dungeon Magazine, and I'd get the kind rejection of, this was a very interesting idea, but we already have something like that happening, or I don't think enough people would be interested in this. And sure enough, a year later, there would be an article that covers exactly what I had sent in, or
Yeah.
something very similar. And I would be outraged. And Wizards of the Coast, well, back then it was TSR, is stealing from me. And what I then came to realize when I became a creator and took in other people's work is that there are no new ideas under the sun. You may think, and I may think, that this idea I have is the most novel thing and no one's ever thought of it. There's 10 million people out there creating D&D content. Nothing that you're creating, it's highly, highly, highly unlikely anything you're creating is new.
Well,
A new book comes out and they've got five domains, but they didn't put in the love domain. So therefore I'm going to make the love domain. There are 25 other people right at that moment making the love domain, and probably somebody at Wizards of the Coast working on it as well.
Right.
So in that sense, they need to have this in there. Otherwise, they would be inundated with people like me as a teenager railing against this horrible company that is stealing my stuff.
And I understand that, but if I were to create lore for an area in the DM's Guild and create an NPC, or I draw a map that has never been illustrated to this level of detail before, and those things were to appear in a product, right? We would know what happened, right? And that's where there should be that, you know, the idea of saying like, and all you can do is get back your damages. You know, like, what are your damages? Well, my damages are probably 0, but you stole my work, right? Like, you didn't damage me, but you profited from my work. And you did wrong, and you know, where's my right?
Absolutely. And you know, we have seen instances where that came very close to happening, but the difference was one might have been on the DM's Guild, where by publishing it, you are sort of giving up your rights to it.
But you aren't. So on the DM's
license.
But on the DM's Guild, it says if we have the right to use it on the DM's Guild, or anyone else can on the DM's Guild, but if we were to use it in a product, we have to talk to you, right? We have to approach and negotiate a deal.
Yeah,
exactly.
So
if that were to not happen,
exactly.
Right? Yeah. It's fascinating. So I don't know. The survey's out there. If you haven't filled it out, I think you have until February 1st, 3rd. Now I forget. I will look that up. But you have, you know, only a few days after you hear that. February 3rd is when it closes. So you have until February 3rd. We included a number of links on people who break down 1.2 and give you different analysis of things. Like Justin Alexander shares his screenshots of the survey and what he thought about different sections. So it is a very interesting piece here, and it'll be super interesting to see where Wizards goes from here once they have assessed the survey results.